Chapter 6 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 6 The Starlight. The Sunday was a bright Sunday in autumn, clear and cool, when early in the morning Cissy and Rachel met to walk in the country. As Coketown cast ashes not only on its own head, but on the neighbourhood's too, after the manner of those pious persons who do penance for their own sins by putting other people into sackcloth, it was customary for those who now and then thirsted for a draught of pure air, which is not absolutely the most wicked among the vanities of life, to get a few miles away by the railroad, and then begin their walk or their lounge in the fields. Cissy and Rachel helped themselves out of the smoke by the usual means, and were put down at a station about midway between the town and Mr. Bounderby's retreat. Though the green landscape was blotted here and there with heaps of coal, it was green elsewhere, and there were trees to see, and there were larks singing, though it was Sunday, and there were pleasant scents in the air, and all was overarched by a bright blue sky. In the distance one way, Coketown showed as a black mist. In another distance hills began to rise. In a third there was a faint change in the light of the horizon when it shone upon the far-off sea. Under their feet the grass was fresh. Beautiful shadows of branches flickered upon it and speckled it. Hedgerows were luxuriant. Everything was at peace. Engines at pits' mouths, and lean old horses, that had won the circle of their daily labour into the ground, were alike quiet. Wheels had ceased for a short space to turn, and the great wheel of earth seemed to revolve without the shocks and noises of another time. They walked on across the fields and down the shady lanes, sometimes getting over a fragment of fence so rotten that it dropped at the touch of the foot, sometimes passing near a wreck of bricks and beams overgrown with grass, marking the site of deserted works. They followed paths and tracks, however slight. Mounds where grass was rank and high, and where brambles, duckweed, and such-like vegetation were confusedly heaped together, they always avoided, for dismal stories were told in that country of the old pits hidden beneath such indications. The sun was high when they sat down to rest. They had seen no one, near or distant, for a long time, and the solitude remained unbroken.
"It is so still here, Rachel, and the way is so untrodden, that I think we must be the first who have been here all the summer."
As Cissy said it, her eyes were attracted by another of those rotten fragments of fence upon the ground. She got up to look at it.
"And yet I don't know. This has not been broken very long. The wood is quite fresh where it gave way. Here are footsteps, too. Oh, Rachel!"
She ran back and caught her round the neck. Rachel had already started up.
"What is the matter?"
"I don't know. There is a hat lying in the grass."
They went forward together. Rachel took it up, shaking from head to foot. She broke into a passion of tears and lamentations. Stephen Blackpool was written in his own hand on the inside.
"Oh, the poor lad, the poor lad! He has been made away with. He is lying murdered here."
Has the hat any blood upon it?"
Cissy faltered. They were afraid to look, but they did examine it, and found no mark of violence, inside or out. It had been lying there for some days, for rain and dew had stained it, and the mark of its shape was on the grass where it had fallen. They looked fearfully about them, without moving, but could see nothing more.
"Rachel, I will go on a little by myself."
She had unclasped her hand, and was in the act of stepping forward, when Rachel caught her in both arms, with a scream that resounded over the wide landscape. Before them, at their very feet, was the brink of a black, ragged chasm hidden by the thick grass. They sprang back, and fell upon their knees, each hiding her face upon the other's neck.
"Oh, my good Lord, he's down there, down there!"
At first this, and her terrific screams, were all that could be got from Rachel, by any tears, by any prayers, by any representations, by any means. It was impossible to hush her, and it was deadly necessary to hold her, or she would have flung herself down the shaft.
"Rachel, dear Rachel, good Rachel, for the love of heaven, not these dreadful cries! Think of Stephen, think of Stephen, think of Stephen!"
By an earnest repetition of this entreaty, poured out in all the agony of such a moment, Sissy at last brought her to be silent, and to look at her with a tearless face of stone.
"Rachel, Stephen may be living. You wouldn't leave him lying maimed at the bottom of this dreadful place a moment, if you could bring help to him?"
"No, no, no, no."
"Don't stir from here, for his sake. Let me go and listen."
She shuddered to approach the pit, but she crept towards it on her hands and knees, and called to him as loud as she could call. She listened, but no sound replied. She called again and listened. Still no answering sound. She did this 20, 30 times. She took a little clod of earth from the broken ground where he had stumbled, and threw it in. She could not hear it fall. The wide prospect, so beautiful in its stillness but a few minutes ago, almost carried despair to her brave heart, as she rose and looked all round her, seeing no help.
"Rachel, we must lose not a moment. We must go in different directions, seeking aid. You shall go by the way we have come, and I will go forward by the path. Tell anyone you see, and everyone, what has happened. Think of Stephen, think of Stephen."
She knew by Rachel's face that she might trust her now, and after standing for a moment to see her running, wringing her hands as she ran, she turned and went upon her own search. She stopped at the hedge to tie her shawl there as a guide to the place, then threw her bonnet aside, and ran as she had never run before. "Run, Sissy, run, in heaven's name! Don't stop for breath! Run, run!" Quickening herself by carrying such entreaties in her thoughts, she ran from field to field, and lane to lane, and place to place, as she had never run before, until she came to a shed by an engine-house, where 2 men lay in the shade, asleep on straw. First to wake them, and next to tell them, all so wild and breathless as she was, what had brought her there, with difficulties. But they no sooner understood her than their spirits were on fire like hers. One of the men was in a drunken slumber, but on his comrades shouting to him that a man had fallen down the old hell shaft, he started out to a pool of dirty water, put his head in it, and came back sober. With these 2 men she ran to another half-mile farther, and with that one to another, while they ran elsewhere. Then a horse was found, and she got another man to ride for life or death to the railroad, and send a message to Louisa, which she wrote and gave him. By this time a whole village was up, and windlasses, ropes, poles, candles, lanterns, all things necessary, were fast collecting and being brought into one place, to be carried to the old hell shaft. It seemed now hours and hours since she had left the lost man lying in the grave where he had been buried alive. She could not bear to remain away from it any longer. It was like deserting him, and she hurried swiftly back, accompanied by a half-dozen labourers, including the drunken man whom the news had sobered, and who was the best man of all. When they came to the old hell shaft, they found it as lonely as she had left it. The men called and listened as she had done, and examined the edge of the chasm, and settled how it had happened, and then sat down to wait until the implements they wanted should come up. Every sound of insects in the air, every stirring of the leaves, every whisper among these men made Sissy tremble, for she thought it was a cry at the bottom of the pit. But the wind blew idly over it, and no sound arose to the surface, and they sat upon the grass, waiting and waiting. After they had waited some time, straggling people who had heard of the accident began to come up. Then the real help of implements began to arrive. In the midst of this Rachel returned, and with her party there was a surgeon, who brought some wine and medicines. But the expectation among the people that the man would be found alive was very slight indeed. There being now people enough present to impede the work, the sobered man put himself at the head of the rest, or was put there by the general consent, and made a large ring round the old hell shaft, and appointed men to keep it. Besides such volunteers as were accepted to work, only Sissy and Rachel were at first permitted within this ring. But later in the day, when the message brought an express from Coketown, Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa and Mr. Bounderby and the whelp were also there. The sun was 4 hours lower than when Sissy and Rachel had first sat down upon the grass, before a means of enabling 2 men to descend securely was rigged with poles and ropes. Difficulties had arisen in the construction of this machine, simple as it was. Requisites had been found wanting, and messages had had to go and return. It was 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the bright autumnal Sunday before a candle was sent down to try the air, while 3 or 4 rough faces stood crowded close together, attentively watching it, the man at the windlass lowering as they were told. The candle was brought up again, feebly burning, and then some water was cast in. Then the bucket was hooked on, and the sobered man and another got in with lights, giving the word, "Lower away." As the rope went out, tight and strained, and the windlass creaked, there was not a breath among the 100 or 200 men and women looking on, that came as it was wont to come. The signal was given, and the windlass stopped, with abundant rope to spare. Apparently so long an interval ensued with the men at the windlass standing idle, that some women shrieked that another accident had happened. But the surgeon, who held the watch, declared 5 minutes not to have elapsed yet, and sternly admonished them to keep silence. He had not well done speaking, when the windlass was reversed and worked again. Practised eyes knew that it did not go as heavily as it would if both workmen had been coming up, and that only one was returning. The rope came in tight and strained, and ring after ring was coiled upon the barrel of the windlass, and all eyes were fastened on the pit. The sobered man was brought up, and leaped out briskly on the grass. There was an universal cry of "Alive or dead?" and then a deep, profound hush. When he said, "Alive!" a great shout arose, and many eyes had tears in them. "But he's hurt very bad," he added, as soon as he could make himself heard again. "Where's doctor? He's hurt so very bad, sir, that we dunno how to get him up." They all consulted together, and looked anxiously at the surgeon, as he asked some questions, and shook his head on receiving the replies. The sun was setting now, and the red light in the evening sky touched every face there, and caused it to be distinctly seen in all its rapt suspense. The consultation ended in the men returning to the windlass, and the pitman going down again, carrying the wine and some other small matters with him. Then the other man came up. In the meantime, under the surgeon's directions, some men brought a hurdle, on which others made a thick bed of spare clothes covered with loose straw, while he himself contrived some bandages and slings from shawls and handkerchiefs. As these were made, they were hung upon an arm of the pitman who had last come up, with instructions how to use them. And as he stood, shown by the light he carried, leaning his powerful loose hand upon one of the poles, and sometimes glancing down the pit, and sometimes glancing round upon the people, he was not the least conspicuous figure in the scene. It was dark now, and torches were kindled. It appeared, from the little this man said to those about him, which was quickly repeated all over the circle, that the lost man had fallen upon a mass of crumbled rubbish with which the pit was half choked up, and that his fall had been further broken by some jagged earth at the side. He lay upon his back with one arm doubled under him, and according to his own belief had hardly stirred since he fell, except that he had moved his free hand to a side pocket, in which he remembered to have some bread and meat, of which he had swallowed crumbs, and had likewise scooped up a little water in it now and then. He had come straight away from his work, on being written to, and had walked the whole journey, and was on his way to Mr. Bounderby's country house after dark, when he fell. He was crossing that dangerous country at such a dangerous time, because he was innocent of what was laid to his charge, and couldn't rest from coming the nearest way to deliver himself up. The old hell shaft, the pitman said, with a curse upon it, was worthy of its bad name to the last, for though Stephen could speak now, he believed it would soon be found to have mangled the life out of him. When all was ready, this man, still taking his last hurried charges from his comrades and the surgeon after the windlass had begun to lower him, disappeared into the pit. The rope went out as before, the signal was made as before, and the windlass stopped. No man removed his hand from it now. Every one waited with his grasp set, and his body bent down to the work, ready to reverse and wind in. At length the signal was given, and all the ring leaned forward. For now the rope came in, tightened and strained to its utmost as it appeared, and the men turned heavily, and the windlass complained. It was scarcely endurable to look at the rope and think of its giving way. But ring after ring was coiled upon the barrel of the windlass safely, and the connecting chains appeared, and finally the bucket with the two men holding on at the sides, a sight to make the head swim and oppress the heart, and tenderly supporting between them, slung and tied within, the figure of a poor, crushed, human creature. A low murmur of pity went round the throng, and the women wept aloud, as this form, almost without form, was moved very slowly from its iron deliverance, and laid upon the bed of straw. At first none but the surgeon went close to it. He did what he could in its adjustment on the couch, but the best that he could do was to cover it. That gently done, he called to him Rachel and Sissy, and at that time the pale, worn, patient face was seen looking up at the sky, with the broken right hand lying barely on the outside of the covering garments, as if waiting to be taken by another hand. They gave him drink, moistened his face with water, and administered some drops of cordial and wine. Though he lay quite motionless looking up at the sky, he smiled and said, "Rachel." She stooped down on the grass at his side, and bent over him until her eyes were between his and the sky, for he could not so much as turn them to look at her.
"Rachel, my dear."
She took his hand. He smiled again, and said,
"Don't let go."
"Thou'rt in great pain, my own dear Stephen."
"I have been, but not now. I have been dreadful and dree and long, my dear, but 'tis o'er now. Ah, Rachel, a muddle, from first to last, a muddle."
The spectre of his old look seemed to pass as he said the word.
"I have fell into the pit, my dear, as a cost we ain't knowledge of folk now living, hundreds and hundreds of men's lives, fathers, sons, brothers, dear to thousands and thousands, and keeping her from want and hunger. I have fell into a pit that had been with fire damp crueller than battle. I ha' read on it in public petition, as ony mon may read, from men that work in pits, in which they are praying and praying to lawmakers, for Christ's sake not to let the work be murder to 'em, but to spur 'em for the wives and children that they loves, as well as gentlefolks loves theirs. When it were in work it killed without need. When 'tis let alone, it kills without need. See how we die and no need, one way and another, in a muddle, every day."
He faintly said it, without any anger against any one, merely as the truth.
"Thy little sister, Rachel, thou hast not forgot her. Thou art not like to forget her, and me so nigh her. Thou knowest, poor, patient, suffering dear, how thou didst work for her, sitting all day long in a little chair at thy window, and how she died, young and misshapen, all along a sickly her as had no need to be, and all along of working people's miserable homes, a muddle, oh, a muddle."
Louisa approached him, but he could not see her, lying with his face turned up to the night sky.
"If aught things that touches us, my dear, was not so muddled, I shouldn't have had to need to come here. If we was not in a muddle amongst ourselves, I shouldn't have been by my own weavers and working brothers so mistook. If Mr. Bounderby had ever knowed me right, if he'd ever knowed me at all, he wouldn't have taken offence with me. He wouldn't have suspected me. But look up yonder, Rachel, look above."
Following his eyes, she saw that he was gazing at a star.
"It has shined upon me,"
he said reverently.
"In my pain and trouble down below, it has shined into my mind. I ha' looked at it and thought of thee, Rachel, till the muddle in my mind have cleared away, above a bit, I hope. If some had been wanting in understanding me better, I too have been wanting in understanding them better. When I got thy letter, I easily believing that what the young lady said and done to me, and what her brother said and done to me, was one, and that there were a wicked plot betwixt 'em. When I fell, I were in anger wi' her, and hurrying on to be as unjust to her as others was to me. But in our judgment, like as in our doings, we mun bear and forbear. In my pain and trouble, looking up yonder, wi' it shining on me, I ha' seen more clear, and I made it my dying prayer that all the world may only come together more, and get a better understanding of one another than when I were in it my own weak sell.
Louisa, hearing what he said, bent over him on the opposite side to Rachel, so that he could see her.
"You heard?"
he said, after a few moments' silence.
"I have not forgot you, lady."
"Yes, Stephen, I have heard you, and your prayer is mine."
"You are your father. Will you take a message to him?"
"He is here,"
said Louisa, with dread.
"Shall I bring him to you?"
"If you please."
Louisa returned with her father. Standing hand in hand, they both looked down upon the solemn countenance.
"Sir, you will clear me and make my name good with all men. This I leave to you."
Mr. Gradgrind was troubled, and asked how.
"Sir,"
was the reply,
"your son will tell you how. Ask him. I make no charges. I leave none ahint me, nor a single word. I have seen and spoken with your son one night. I ask no more of you than you clear me, and I trust to you to do it."
The bearers being now ready to carry him away, and the surgeon being anxious for his removal, those who had torches or lanterns prepared to go in front of the litter. Before it was raised, and while they were arranging how to go, he said to Rachel, looking upward at the star,
"Often as I come to mysen and found it shining on me down there in me trouble, I thought it were the star as guided to our Saviour's home. I almost think it be the very star."
They lifted him up, and he was overjoyed to find that they were about to take him in the direction whither the star seemed to him to lead.
"Rachel, beloved lass, don't let go of my hand. We may walk together to-night, my dear."
I will hold thy hand and keep beside thee, Stephen, all the way.
"Bless thee. Will somebody be pleased to cover my face?"
They carried him very gently along the fields, and down the lanes, and over the wide landscape, Rachel always holding the hand in hers. Very few whispers broke the mournful silence. It was soon a funeral procession. The star had shown him where to find the God of the poor, and through humility and sorrow and forgiveness he had gone to his Redeemer's rest. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 7. Whelp-Hunting. Before the ring formed round the old hell shaft was broken, one figure had disappeared from within it. Mr. Bounderby and his shadow had not stood near Louisa, who held her father's arm, but in a retired place by themselves. When Mr. Gradgrind was summoned to the couch, Sissy, attentive to all that happened, slipped behind that wicked shadow, a sight in the horror of his face, if there had been eyes there but for any sight but one, and whispered in his ear, Without turning his head, he conferred with her for a few moments, and vanished. Thus the whelp had gone out of the circle before the people moved. When the father reached home, he sent a message to Mr. Bounderby's, desiring his son to come to him directly. The reply was, that Mr. Bounderby, having missed him in the crowd, and seen nothing of him since, had supposed him to be at Stone Lodge.
"I believe, father,"
said Louisa,
"he will not come back to town to-night."
Mr. Gradgrind turned away, and said no more. In the morning he went down to the bank himself as soon as it was opened, and seeing his son's place empty, he had not the courage to look in first, went back along the street to meet Mr. Bounderby on his way there, to whom he said that, for reasons he would soon explain, but entreated not then to be asked for, he had found it necessary to employ his son at a distance for a little while. Also that he was charged with the duty of vindicating Stephen Blackpool's memory, and declaring the thief. Mr. Bounderby, quite confounded, stood stock still in the street after his father-in-law had left him, swelling like an immense soap-bubble, without its beauty. Mr. Gradgrind went home, locking himself in his room, and kept it all that day. When Sissy and Louisa tapped at his door, he said, without opening it,
"Not now, my dears. In the evening."
On their return in the evening, he said,
"I am not able yet. To-morrow."
He ate nothing all day, and had no candle after dark, and they heard him walking to and fro late at night. But in the morning he appeared at breakfast at the usual hour, and took his usual place at the table. Aged and bent he looked, and quite bowed down, yet he looked a wiser man, and a better man, than in the days when in this life he wanted nothing but facts. Before he left the room he appointed a time for them to come to him, and so, with his grey head drooping, went away.
"Dear father,"
said Louisa, when they kept their appointment,
"you have 3 young children left. They will be different. I will be different yet, with heaven's help."
She gave her hand to Sissy, as if she meant with her help too.
"Your wretched brother,"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"Do you think he had planned this robbery when he went with you to the lodging?"
"I fear so, father. I know he had wanted money very much, and had spent a great deal."
"The poor man being about to leave the town, it came into his evil brain to cast suspicion on him?"
"I think it must have flashed upon him while he sat there, father, for I asked him to go there with me. The visit did not originate with him."
"He had some conversation with the poor man. Did he take him aside?"
"He took him out of the room. I asked him afterwards why he had done so, and he made a plausible excuse. But since last night, father, and when I remember the circumstances by its light, I am afraid I can imagine too truly what passed between them."
"Let me know,"
said her father,
"if your thoughts present your guilty brother in the same dark view as mine."
"I fear, father,"
hesitated Louisa,
"that he must have made some representation to Stephen Blackpool, perhaps in my name, perhaps in his own, which induced him to do in good faith and honesty what he had never done before, and to wait about the bank those 2 or 3 nights before he left the town."
"Too plain,"
returned the father.
"Too plain."
He shaded his face, and remained silent for some moments. Recovering himself, he said,
"And now, how is he to be found? How is he to be saved from justice? In the few hours that I can possibly allow to elapse before I publish the truth, how is he to be found by us, and only by us? £10,000 could not effect it."
Sissy has effected it, father.
He raised his eyes to where she stood, like a good fairy in his house, and said in a tone of softened gratitude and grateful kindness,
"It is always you, my child."
We had our fears,
Sissy explained, glancing at Louisa,
before yesterday, and when I saw you brought to the side of the litter last night, and heard what passed, being close to Rachel all the time, I went to him when no one saw, and said to him, "Don't look at me. See where your father is. Escape at once, for his sake and your own." He was in a tremble before I whispered to him, and he started and trembled more then, and said, "Where can I go? I have very little money, and I don't know who will hide me." I thought of father's old circus. I have not forgotten where Mr. Sleary goes at this time of year, and I read of him in a paper only the other day. I told him to hurry there, and tell his name, and ask Mr. Sleary to hide him till I came. "I'll get to him before the morning," he said, and I saw him shrink away among the people.
"Thank heaven!"
exclaimed his father.
"He may be got abroad yet."
It was more hopeful, as the town to which Sissy had directed him was within 3 hours' journey of Liverpool, whence he could be swiftly despatched to any part of the world. But caution being necessary in communicating with him, for there was a greater danger every moment of his being suspected now, and nobody could be sure at heart but that Mr. Bounderby himself, in a bullying vein of public zeal, might play a Roman part, it was consented that Sissy and Louisa should repair to a place in question, by a circuitous course, alone, and that the unhappy father, setting forth in an opposite direction, should get round to the same bourne by another and wider route. It was further agreed that he should not present himself to Mr. Sleary, lest his intention should be mistrusted, or the intelligence of his arrival should cause his son to take flight anew, but that the communication should be left to Sissy and Louisa to open, and that they should inform the cause of so much misery and disgrace, of his father's being at hand, and of the purpose for which they had come. When these arrangements had been well considered, and were fully understood by all three, it was time to begin to carry them into execution. Early in the afternoon Mr. Gradgrind walked directly from his own house into the country, to be taken up on the line by which he was to travel, and at night the remaining two set forth upon their different course, encouraged by not seeing any face they knew. The two travelled all night, except when they were left off, for odd numbers of minutes, at branch places, up illimitable flights of steps, or down wells, which was the only variety of those branches, and early in the morning were turned out on a swamp, a mile or two from the town they sought. From this dismal spot they were rescued by a savage old postilion, who happened to be up early, kicking a horse and a fly, and so were smuggled into the town by all the back lanes where the pigs lived, which, although not a magnificent or even savoury approach, was, as is usual in such cases, the legitimate highway. The first thing they saw on entering the town was the skeleton of Sleary's circus. The company had departed for another town more than 20 miles off, and had opened there last night. The connection between the two places was by a hilly turnpike road, and the travelling on that road was very slow. Though they took but a hasty breakfast, and no rest, which it would have been in vain to seek under such anxious circumstances, it was noon before they began to find the bills of Sleary's horse-riding on barns and walls, and 1 o'clock when they stopped in the market-place. A grand morning performance by the riders, commencing at that very hour, was in course of announcement by the bellman, as they set their feet upon the stones of the street. Sissy recommended that, to avoid making inquiries and attracting attention in the town, they should present themselves to pay at the door. If Mr. Sleary were taking the money, he would be sure to know her, and would proceed with discretion. If he were not, he would be sure to see them inside, and knowing what he had done with the fugitive, would proceed with discretion still. Therefore they repaired, with fluttering hearts, to the well-remembered booth. The flag with the inscription "Series Horse Riding" was there, and the Gothic niche was there, but Mr. Sleary was not. Master Kidderminster, grown too maturely turfy to be received by the wildest credulity as Cupid any more, had yielded to the invincible force of circumstances, and his beard, and in the capacity of a man who made himself generally useful, presided on this occasion over the exchequer, having also a drum in reserve, on which to expend his leisure moments and superfluous forces. In the extreme sharpness of his look-out for base coin, Mr. Kidderminster, as at present situated, never saw anything but money. So Sissy passed him unrecognized, and they went in. The Emperor of Japan, on a steady old horse stencilled with black spots, was twirling 5 wash-hand basins at once, as it is the favourite recreation of that monarch to do. Sissy, though well acquainted with his royal line, had no personal knowledge of the present emperor, and his reign was peaceful. Miss Josephine Sleary, in her celebrated, graceful, equestrian Tyrolean flower act, was then announced by a new clown, who humorously said cauliflower act, and Mr. Sleary appeared, leading her in. Mr. Sleary had only made one cut at the clown with his long whiplash, and the clown had only said, "If they do so again, I'll throw the horse at you," when Sissy was recognized both by father and daughter. But they got through the act with great self-possession, and Mr. Sleary, saving for the first instant, conveyed no more expression into his locomotive eye than into his fixed one. The performance seemed a little long to Sissy and Louisa, particularly when it stopped to afford the clown an opportunity of telling Mr. Sleary, who said,
"Indeed, sir,"
to all his observations in the calmest way, and with his eye on the house, about 2 legs sitting on 3 legs, looking at 1 leg, when in came 4 legs, and laid hold of 1 leg, and got up 2 legs, caught hold of 3 legs, and threw 'em at 4 legs, who ran away with 1 leg. For, although an ingenious allegory related to a butcher, a 3-legged stool, a dog, and a leg of mutton, this narrative consumed time, and they were in great suspense. At last, however, little fair-haired Josephine made her curtsy amid great applause, and the clown, left alone in the ring, had just warmed himself, and said, "Now I'll have a turn," when Sissy was touched on the shoulder, and beckoned out. She took Louisa with her, and they were received by Mr. Sleary in a very little private apartment, with canvas sides, a grass floor, and a wooden ceiling, all aslant, on which the box company stamped their approbation, as if they were coming through.
"Cecilia,"
said Mr. Sleary, who had brandy and water at hand,
"it does me good to see you. You was always a favourite with us, and you've done us credit since the old times, I'm sure. You must see our people, my dear, afore we speak of business, or they'll break their hearts, especially the women. Here's Josephine has been and got married to E.W.B. Childers, and he hath got a boy, and though he's only 3 years old, he sticks on to any pony you can bring against him. He's named the Little Wonder of Scholastic Equitation, and if you don't hear of that boy at Astley's, you'll hear of him at Paris. And you recollect Kiddermister, that was thought to be rather sweet upon yourself? Well, he's married too. Married a widder, old enough to be his mother. She was tight-rope, she was, and now she's nothing on account of fat. They've got 2 children, though we're strong in the fairy business and the nursery dodge. If you was to see our children in the wood, with their father and mother both a-dying on a horse, their uncle a-receiving of them, and as with wards upon a horse, themselves both a-going a-blackberrying on a horse, and the robins a-coming in to cover 'em with leaves upon a horse, you say it was the completest thing as ever you set your eyes upon. And you remember Emma Gordon, my dear, as was almost a mother to you? Of course you do. I needn't ask. Well, Emma, she's lost her husband. He was throwed a heavy backfall off an elephant in a sort of a pagoda thing, as the Sultan of the Indies, and he never got the better of it. And she married a second time. Married a cheesemonger as fell in love with her from the front, and he's a overseer and making a fortune.
These various changes Mr. Sleary, very short of breath now, related with great heartiness, and with a wonderful kind of innocence, considering what a bleary and brandy-and-watery old veteran he was. Afterwards he brought in Josephine, and E.W.B. Childers, rather deeply lined in the jaws by daylight, and the Little Wonder of Scholastic Equitation, and, in a word, all the company. Amazing creatures they were in Louisa's eyes, so white and pink of complexion, so scant of dress, and so demonstrative of leg. But it was very agreeable to see them crowding about Sissy, and very natural in Sissy to be unable to refrain from tears.
There, now Cecilia has kissed all the children, and hugged all the women, and shaken hands all round with all the men, clear every one of you, and ring in the band for the second part.
As soon as they were gone, he continued in a low tone.
Now, Cecilia, I don't ask to know any secrets, but I suppose I may consider this to be Miss Squire.
This is his sister, yes.
And t'other one's daughter? That's what I mean. Hope I see you well, miss, and I hope the squire's well.
My father will be here soon,
said Louisa, anxious to bring him to the point.
Is my brother safe?
Safe and sound,
he replied.
I want you just to take a peep at the ring, miss, through here. Cecilia, you know the dodges. Find the spy-hole for yourself.
They each looked through a chink in the boards.
That's Jack the Giant Killer, piece of comic infant business,
said Sleary.
There's a property house, you see, for Jack to hide in. There's my clown, with a saucepan lid and a spit, for Jack's servant. There's little Jack himself, in a splendid suit of armor. There's 2 comic black servants, twice as big as the house, to stand by it and to bring it in and clear it. And the giant, a very expensive basket one. He ain't on yet. Now, do you see 'em all?
Yes.
Yes.
They both said.
Look at 'em again,
said Sleary.
Look at 'em well. You see 'em all? Very good. Now, miss.
He put a form for them to sit on.
I have my opinions, and the squire, your father, has his. I don't want to know what your brother's been up to. It's better for me not to know. All I say is, the squire has stood by Cecilia, and I'll stand by the squire. Your brother is one of them black servants."
Louisa uttered an exclamation, partly of distress, partly of satisfaction.
"It's a fact,"
said Sleary.
"and even knowing it, you couldn't put your finger on him. Let the squire come. I shall keep your brother here after the performance. I shan't undress him, nor yet wash his paint off. Let the squire come here after the performance, or come here yourself after the performance, and you shall find your brother, and have the whole place to talk to him in. Never mind the looks of him, as long as he's well hid."
Louisa, with many thanks and with a lightened load, detained Mr. Sleary no longer then. She left her love for her brother, with her eyes full of tears, and she and Sissy went away until later in the afternoon. Mr. Gradgrind arrived within an hour afterwards. He too had encountered no one whom he knew, and was now sanguine, with Sleary's assistance, of getting his disgraced son to Liverpool in the night. As neither of them could be his companion without almost identifying him under any disguise, he prepared a letter to a correspondent whom he could trust, beseeching him to ship the bearer off to any coast, to North or South America, or any distant part of the world to which he could be the most speedily and privately dispatched. This done, they walked about, waiting for the service to be quite vacated, not only by the audience, but by the company and by the horses. After watching it a long time, they saw Mr. Sleary bring out a chair and sit down by the side-door, smoking, as if that were his signal that they might approach.
"Your servant, squire,"
was his cautious salutation as they passed in.
"If you want me, you'll find me here. You mustn't mind your son having a comic livery on."
They all three went in. Mr. Gradgrind sat down forlorn on the clown's performing chair in the middle of the ring. On one of the back benches, remote in the subdued light and the strangeness of the place, sat the villainous whelp, sulky to the last, whom he had the misery to call his son. In a preposterous coat like a beadle's, with cuffs and flaps exaggerated to an unspeakable extent, in an immense waistcoat, knee-breeches, buckled shoes, and a mad-cocked hat, with nothing fitting him, and everything of coarse material, moth-eaten and full of holes, with seams in his black face, where fear and heat had started through the greasy composition daubed all over it, anything so grimly, detestably, ridiculously shameful as the whelp in his comic livery, Mr. Gradgrind never could by any other means have believed in, weighable and measurable fact though it was. And one of his model children had come to this. At first the whelp would not draw any nearer, but persisted in remaining up there by himself, yielding at length, if any concession so sullenly made can be called yielding, to the entreaties of Sissy, for Louisa he disowned altogether. He came down, bench by bench, until he stood in the sawdust, on the verge of the circle, as far as possible within its limits from where his father sat.
How was this done?
asked the father.
How was what done?
This robbery,
said the father, raising his voice upon the word.
I forced the safe myself overnight, and shut it up ajar before I went away. I had had the key that was found made long before. I dropped it that morning that it might be supposed to have been used. I didn't take the money all at once. I pretended to put my balance away every night, but I didn't. Now you know all about it.
If a thunderbolt had fallen on me,
said the father,
it would have shocked me less than this.
I don't see why,
grumbled the son.
So many people are employed in situations of trust. So many people out of so many will be dishonest. I've heard you talk 100 times of its being a law. How can I help laws? You have comforted others with such things, father. Comfort yourself.
The father buried his face in his hands, and the son stood in his disgraceful grotesqueness, biting straw. His hands, with the black partly worn away inside, looking like the hands of a monkey. The evening was fast closing in, and from time to time he turned the whites of his eyes restlessly and impatiently towards his father. They were the only parts of his face that showed any life or expression. The pigment upon it was so thick.
You must be got to Liverpool, and sent abroad.
I suppose I must. I can't be more miserable anywhere,
whimpered the whelp.
And I've been here ever since I can remember. That's one thing.
Mr. Gradgrind went to the door, and returned with Sleary, to whom he submitted the question, how to get this deplorable object away.
Why, I've been thinking of it, Squire. There's not much time to lose. Though you must say yes or no, it's over 20 miles to the rail. There's a coach in half an hour that goes to the rail, purpose to catch the mail train. That train will take him right to Liverpool.
But look at him. Will any coach—
I don't mean that he shall go in the comic livery,
said Sleary.
Say the word, and I'll make a Joskin of him out of the wardrobe in 5 minutes.
I don't understand,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
A Joskin, a carter. Make up your mind quick, Squire. There'll be beer to fetch. I've never met with nothing but beer as'll ever clean a comic blackamoor.
Mr. Gradgrind rapidly assented. Mr. Sleary rapidly turned out from a box a smock frock, a felt hat, and other essentials. The whelp rapidly changed clothes behind a screen of baize. Mr. Sleary rapidly brought beer, and washed him white again.
Now,
said Sleary,
come along to the coach, and jump up behind, and I'll go with you there, and they'll suppose you one of my people. Say farewell to your family, and sarp's the word.
Here is your letter,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
All necessary means will be provided for you. Atone by repentance and better conduct for the shocking action you have committed, and the dreadful consequences to which it has led. Give me your hand, my poor boy, and may God forgive you as I do.
The culprit was moved to a few abject tears by these words and their pathetic tone. But when Louisa opened her arms, he repulsed her afresh.
Not you. I don't want to have anything to say to you.
Oh, Tom, Tom, do we end so, after all my love?
After all your love?
He returned obdurately.
Pretty love. Leaving old Bounderby to himself, and packing my best friend Mr. Harthouse off, and going home just when I was in the greatest danger. Pretty love that. Coming out with every word about our having gone to that place, when you saw the net was gathering round me. Pretty love that. You're regularly giving me up. You never cared for me.
Sarp's the word,
said Sleary at the door. They all confusedly went out, Louisa crying to him that she forgave him, and loved him still, and that he would one day be sorry to have left her so, and glad to think of these her last words far away, when someone ran against them. Mr. Gradgrind and Sissy, who were both before him, while his sister yet clung to his shoulder, stopped and recoiled. For there was Bitzer, out of breath, his thin lips parted, his thin nostrils distended, his white eyelashes quivering, his colourless face more colourless than ever, as if he ran himself into a white heat, when other people ran themselves into a glow. There he stood, panting and heaving, as if he had never stopped since the night, long ago, when he had run them down before.
"I'm sorry to interfere with your plans,"
said Bitzer, shaking his head.
"but I can't allow myself to be done by horse riders. I must have young Mr. Tom. He mustn't be got away by horse riders. Here he is in a smock frock, and I must have him."
Chapter 8 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 8. Philosophical. They went back into the booth, Sleary shutting the door to keep intruders out. Bitzer, still holding the paralyzed culprit by the collar, stood in the ring, blinking at his old patron through the darkness of the twilight.
"Bitzer,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, broken down and miserably submissive to him.
"have you a heart?"
"The circulation, sir?"
returned Bitzer, smiling at the oddity of the question.
"Couldn't be carried on without one. No man, sir, acquainted with the facts established by Harvey relating to the circulation of the blood, can doubt that I have a heart."
"Is it accessible,"
cried Mr. Gradgrind,
"to any compassionate influence?"
"It is accessible to reason, sir."
returned the excellent young man.
"And to nothing else."
They stood looking at each other, Mr. Gradgrind's face as white as the pursuer's.
"What motive, even what motive in reason, can you have for preventing the escape of this wretched youth?"
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"And crushing his miserable father. See his sister here. Pity us."
"Sir,"
returned Bitzer, in a very business-like and logical manner,
"since you ask me what motive I have in reason for taking young Mr. Tom back to Coketown, it is only reasonable to let you know, I have suspected young Mr. Tom of this bank robbery from the first. I had my eye upon him before that time, for I knew his ways. I have kept my observations to myself, but I have made them, and I have got ample proofs against him now, besides his running away, and besides his own confession, which I was just in time to overhear. I had the pleasure of watching your house yesterday morning, and following you here. I am going to take young Mr. Tom back to Coketown, in order to deliver him over to Mr. Bounderby. Sir, I have no doubt whatever that Mr. Bounderby will then promote me to young Mr. Tom's situation, and I wish to have his situation, sir, for it will be a rise to me, and will do me good."
"If this is solely a question of self-interest with you,"
Mr. Gradgrind began.
"I beg your pardon for interrupting you, sir,"
returned Bitzer,
"but I am sure you know that the whole social system is a question of self-interest. What you must always appeal to is a person's self-interest. It's your only hold. We are so constituted. I was brought up in that catechism when I was very young, sir, as you are aware."
"What sum of money,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"will you set against your expected promotion?"
"Thank you, sir,"
returned Bitzer,
"for hinting at the proposal, but I will not set any sum against it. Knowing that your clear head would propose that alternative, I have gone over the calculations in my mind, and I find that to compound a felony, even on very high terms indeed, would not be as safe and good for me as my improved prospects in the bank."
"Bitzer,"
said Mr. Gradgrind, stretching out his hands as though he would have said, "See how miserable I am."
"Bitzer, I have but one chance left to soften you. You were many years at my school. If, in remembrance of the pains bestowed upon you there, you can persuade yourself in any degree to disregard your present interest and release my son, I entreat and pray you to give him the benefit of that remembrance.
I really wonder, sir,
rejoined the old pupil in an argumentative manner,
to find you taking a position so untenable. My schooling was paid for. It was a bargain, and when I came away, the bargain ended.
It was a fundamental principle of the Gradgrind philosophy that everything was to be paid for. Nobody was ever on any account to give anybody anything, or render anybody help without purchase. Gratitude was to be abolished, and the virtues springing from it were not to be. Every inch of the existence of mankind, from birth to death, was to be a bargain across a counter, and if we didn't get to heaven that way, it was not a politico-economical place, and we had no business there.
I don't deny,
added Bitzer,
that my schooling was cheap, but that comes right, sir. I was made in the cheapest market, and have to dispose of myself in the dearest.
He was a little troubled here by Louisa and Sissy crying.
Pray don't do that,
said he.
It's no use doing that. It only worries. You seem to think that I have some animosity against young Mr. Tom, whereas I have none at all. I am only going on the reasonable grounds I have mentioned to take him back to Coketown. If he was to resist, I should set up the cry of, "Stop, thief!" But he won't resist, you may depend upon it.
Mr. Sleary, who, with his mouth open and his rolling eye as immovably jammed in his head as his fixed one, had listened to these doctrines with profound attention, here stepped forward.
Squire, you know perfectly well, and your daughter knows perfectly well, better than you, because I said it to her, that I didn't know what your son had done, and that I didn't want to know. I said it was better not, though I only thought then it was some skylarking. However, this young man having made it known to be a robbery of a bank, why, that's a serious thing. Much too serious a thing for me to compound, as this young man hath very properly called it. Consequently, Squire, you mustn't quarrel with me if I take this young man's side, and say he's right, and there's no help for it. But I tell you what I'll do, Squire. I'll drive your son and this young man over to the rail, and prevent exposure here. I can't consent to do more, but I'll do that.
Fresh lamentations from Louisa, and deeper affliction on Mr. Gradgrind's part, followed this desertion of them by their last friend. But Sissy glanced at him with great attention, nor did she in her breast misunderstand him. As they were all going out again, he favoured her with one slight roll of his movable eye, desiring her to linger behind. As he locked the door, he said excitedly,
"The Squire stood by you, Cecilia, and I'll stand by the Squire. More than that, this is a precious rascal, and belongs to that bluttering cove that my people nearly pitched out o-winder. It'll be a dark night. I've got a horse that'll do anything but speak. I've got a pony that'll go 15 miles an hour with Childress driving of him. I've got a dog that'll keep a man to one place 24 hours. Get a word with the young Squire. Tell him when he sees our horse begin to dance, not to be afraid of being spilt, but to look out for a pony gig coming up. Tell him when he sees that gig close by to jump down, and it'll take him off at a rattling pace. If my dog lets this young man stir a peg on foot, I give him leave to go. And if my horse ever stirs from the spot where he begins a-dancing till the morning, I don't know him. Sharp's the word."
The word was so sharp that in 10 minutes Mr. Childers, sauntering about the market-place in a pair of slippers, had his cue, and Mr. Sleary's equipage was ready. It was a fine sight to behold the learned dog barking round it, and Mr. Sleary instructing him, with his one practicable eye, that Bitzer was the object of his particular attentions. Soon after dark they all three got in and started, the learned dog, a formidable creature, already pinning Bitzer with his eye, and sticking close to the wheel on his side, that he might be ready for him in the event of his showing the slightest disposition to alight. The other three sat up at the inn all night in great suspense. At 8 o'clock in the morning Mr. Sleary and the dog reappeared, both in high spirits.
"All right, Squire,"
said Mr. Sleary.
"Your son may be aboard a ship by this time. Childers took him off an hour and a half after we left there last night. The horse danced the polka till he was dead beat. He would have waltzed if he hadn't been in harness. And then I gave him the word, and he went to sleep comfortable. When that precious young rascal said he'd go forward afoot, the dog hung on to his neck-handkerchief with all 4 legs in the air, and pulled him down and rolled him over. Though he come back into the drag, and there he sat, till he turned the horse's head at 6:30 this morning."
Mr. Gradgrind overwhelmed him with thanks, of course, and hinted as delicately as he could at a handsome remuneration in money.
"I don't want money myself, Squire, but Childers is a family man, and if you was to offer him a £5 note, it mightn't be unacceptable. Likewise, if you was to stand a collar for the dog, or a set of bells for the horse, I should be very glad to take 'em. Brandy and water I always take. If you wouldn't think it going too far, Squire, to make a little spread for the company at about 3 6 a head, not reckoning loose, it would make 'em happy."
All these little tokens of his gratitude Mr. Gradgrind very willingly undertook to render, though he thought them far too slight, he said, for such a service.
"Very well, Squire. Then if you'll only give a horse-riding, a bespeak, whenever you can, you'll more than balance the account. Now, Squire, if your daughter will excuse me, I should like one parting word with you."
Louisa and Sissy withdrew to an adjoining room. Mr. Sleary, stirring and drinking his brandy and water as he stood, went on.
"Squire, you don't need to be told that dogs is wonderful animals."
"Their instinct,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"is surprising."
"Whatever you call it, and I'm blessed if I know what to call it,"
said Sleary.
"It is astonishing, the way in which a dog'll find you, the distance he'll come."
"His scent,"
said Mr. Gradgrind,
"being so fine."
"I'm blessed if I know what to call it,"
repeated Sleary, shaking his head.
"But I have had dogs find me, Squire, in a way that made me think whether that dog hadn't gone to another dog and said, 'You don't happen to know a person of the name of Sleary, do you? Person of the name of Sleary in the horse-riding way? Stout man, game eye?' And whether that dog mightn't have said, 'Well, I can't say I know him myself, but I know a dog that I think would be likely to be acquainted with him,' and whether that dog mightn't have thought it over and said, 'Sleary, Sleary, oh, yes, to be sure. A friend of mine mentioned him to me at one time. I can get you his address directly.' In consequence of my being afore the public, and going about so much, you see, there must be a number of dogs acquainted with me, Squire, that I don't know."
Mr. Gradgrind seemed to be quite confounded by this speculation.
"Anyway,"
said Sleary, after putting his lips to his brandy and water.
"It's 14 months ago, Squire, since we was at Chester. We was getting up our children in the wood one morning, when there comes into our ring by the stage door a dog. He had travelled a long way. He was in a very bad condition. He was lame and pretty well blind. He went round to our children one after another, as if he was a-seeking for a child he knowed. And then he come to me, and throwed hisself up behind, and stood on his 2 forelegs, weak as he was, and then he wagged his tail and died. Squire, that dog was Merrylegs."
Cissy's father's dog?
"Cecilia's father's old dog. Now, Squire, I can take my oath from my knowledge of that dog that that man was dead and buried afore that dog come back to me. Josephine and Childers and me talked it over a long time, whether I should write or not, but we agreed, no, there's nothing comfortable to tell. Why unsettle her mind and make her unhappy? Though whether her father basely deserted her, or whether he broke his own heart alone rather than pull her down along with him, never will be known now, Squire, not till we know how the dogs findeth us out."
She keeps the bottle that he sent her for to this hour, and she will believe in his affection to the last moment of her life,
said Mr. Gradgrind.
"It seems to present 2 things to a person, don't it, Squire?"
said Mr. Sleary, musing as he looked down into the depths of his brandy and water.
"One, that there is a love in the world, not all self-interest after all, but something very different t'other, that it has a way of its own of calculating or not calculating, which somehow or another is at least as hard to give a name to as the ways of the dogs is."
Mr. Gradgrind looked out of window, and made no reply. Mr. Sleary emptied his glass, and recalled the ladies.
"Cecilia, my dear, kiss me and good-bye. Miss Squire, to see you treating of her like a sister, and a sister that you trust and honor with all your heart and more, is a very pretty sight to me. I hope your brother may live to be better deserving of you, and a better comfort to you. Squire, shake hands, first and last. Don't be cross with us, poor vagabonds. People must be amused. They can't be always a-learning, nor yet they can't be always a-working, and ain't made for it. You must have us, Squire. Do the wise thing, and the kind thing, too, and make the best of us, not the worst. And I never thought before,"
said Mr. Sleary, putting his head in at the door again. Chapter 9 of Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Hard Times, by Charles Dickens. Chapter 9. Final. It is a dangerous thing to see anything in the sphere of a vain blusterer before the vain blusterer sees it himself. Mr. Bounderby felt that Mrs. Sparsit had audaciously anticipated him, and presumed to be wiser than he. He turned this presumption, on the part of a woman in her dependent position, over and over in his mind, until it accumulated with turning, like a great snowball. At last he made the discovery that to discharge this highly connected female, to have it in his power to say,
"She was a woman of family, and wanted to stick to me, but I wouldn't have it, and I got rid of her,"
would be to get the utmost possible amount of crowning glory out of the connection, and at the same time to punish Mrs. Sparsit according to her deserts. Filled fuller than ever with this great idea, Mr. Bounderby came in to lunch, and sat himself down in the dining-room of former days, where his portrait was. Mrs. Sparsit sat by the fire, with her foot in her cotton stirrup, little thinking whither she was posting. Since the Pegler affair, this gentlewoman had covered her pity for Mr. Bounderby with a veil of quiet melancholy and contrition. In virtue thereof, it had become her habit to assume a woeful look, which woeful look she now bestowed upon her patron.
"What's the matter now, ma'am?"
said Mr. Bounderby, in a very short, rough way.
"Pray, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
"do not bite my nose off."
"Bite your nose off, ma'am?"
repeated Mr. Bounderby.
"Your nose?"
Meaning, as Mrs. Sparsit conceived, that it was too developed a nose for the purpose, after which offensive implication he cut himself a crust of bread, and threw the knife down with a noise. Mrs. Sparsit took her foot out of her stirrup, and said,
"Mr. Bounderby, sir?"
"Well, ma'am?"
retorted Mr. Bounderby.
"What you staring at?"
"May I ask, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit,
"have you been ruffled this morning?"
"Yes, ma'am."
"May I inquire, sir,"
pursued the injured woman,
"whether I am the unfortunate cause of your having lost your temper?"
"Now, I'll tell you what, ma'am,"
said Bounderby,
"I am not come here to be bullied. A female may be highly connected, but she can't be permitted to bother and badger a man in my position, and I am not going to put up with it."
Mr. Bounderby felt it necessary to get on, foreseeing that if he allowed of details, he would be beaten. Mrs. Sparsit first elevated, then knitted her Coriolanian eyebrows, gathered up her work into its proper basket, and rose.
"Sir,"
said she, majestically,
"it is apparent to me that I am in your way at present. I will retire to my own apartment."
"Allow me to open the door, ma'am."
"Thank you, sir. I can do it for myself."
"You had better allow me, ma'am,"
said Bounderby, passing her and getting his hand upon the lock,
"because I can take the opportunity of saying a word to you before you go, Mrs. Sparsit, ma'am. I rather think you are cramped here, d'you know. It appears to me that, under my humble roof, there's hardly opening enough for a lady of your genius in other people's affairs."
Mrs. Sparsit gave him a look of the darkest scorn, and said, with great politeness,
"Really, sir?"
"I have been thinking it over, you see, since the late affairs have happened, ma'am," said
Bounderby,
"and it appears to my poor judgment—"
"Oh, pray, sir,"
Mrs. Sparsit interposed with sprightly cheerfulness,
"don't disparage your judgment. Everybody knows how unerring Mr. Bounderby's judgment is. Everybody has had proofs of it. It must be the theme of general conversation. Disparage anything in yourself but your judgment, sir,"
said Mrs. Sparsit, laughing. Mr. Bounderby, very red and uncomfortable, resumed,
"It appears to me, ma'am, I say, that a different sort of establishment altogether would bring out a lady of your powers. Such as an establishment as your relations, Lady Scadger's, now. Don't you think you might find some affairs there, ma'am, to interfere with?"
"It never occurred to me before, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit,
"but now you mention it, should think it highly probable."
"Then supposing you try, ma'am."
said Bounderby, laying an envelope with a cheque in it in her little basket.
"You can take your own time for going, ma'am, but perhaps in the meanwhile it will be more agreeable to a lady of your powers of mind to eat her meals by herself, and not to be intruded upon. I really ought to apologise to you, being only Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, for having stood in your light so long."
"Pray don't name it, sir,"
returned Mrs. Sparsit.
"If that portrait could speak, sir. But it has the advantage over the original of not possessing the power of committing itself and disgusting others. It would testify that a long period has elapsed since I first habitually addressed it as the picture of a noodle. Nothing that a noodle does can awaken surprise or indignation. The proceedings of a noodle can only inspire contempt."
Thus saying, Mrs. Sparsit, with her Roman features like a medal struck to commemorate her scorn of Mr. Bounderby, surveyed him fixedly from head to foot, swept disdainfully past him, and ascended the staircase. Mr. Bounderby closed the door, and stood before the fire, projecting himself, after his old explosive manner, into his portrait, and into futurity. Into how much of futurity? He saw Mrs. Sparsit fighting out a daily fight at the points of all the weapons in the female armoury, with the grudging, smarting, peevish, tormenting Lady Scadgers, still laid up in bed with her mysterious leg, and gobbling her insufficient income down by about the middle of every quarter, in a mean little airless lodging, a mere closet for one, a mere crib for two. But did he see more? Did he catch any glimpse of himself making a show of Bitzer to strangers, as the rising young man, so devoted to his master's great merits, who had won young Tom's place, and had almost captured young Tom himself, in the times when by various rascals he was spirited away? Did he see any faint reflection of his own image making a vain glorious will, whereby 25 humbugs, past 55 years of age, each taking upon himself the name Josiah Bounderby of Coketown, should for ever dine in Bounderby Hall, for ever lodge in Bounderby Buildings, for ever attend a Bounderby chapel, for ever go to sleep under a Bounderby chaplain, for ever be supported out of a Bounderby estate, and for ever nauseate all healthy stomachs with a vast amount of Bounderby balderdash and bluster? Had he any prescience of the day, 5 years to come, when Josiah Bounderby of Coketown was to die of a fit in the Coketown street, and this same precious will was to begin its long career of quibble, plunder, false pretences, vile example, little service, and much law? Probably not. Yet the portrait was to see it all out. Here was Mr. Gradgrind, on the same day and in the same hour, sitting thoughtful in his own room. How much of futurity did he see? Did he see himself a white-haired, decrepit man, bending his hitherto inflexible theories to appointed circumstances, making his facts and figures subservient to faith, hope, and charity, and no longer trying to grind that heavenly trio in his dusty little mills? Did he catch sight of himself, therefore, much despised by his late political associates? Did he see them, in the era of its being quite settled that the national dustmen have only to do with one another, and owe no duty to an abstraction called a people, taunting the honourable gentleman with this and with that and with what not, 5 nights a week, until the small hours of the morning, Probably he had that much foreknowledge, knowing his men. Here was Louisa, on the night of the same day, watching the fire as in days of yore, though with a gentler and a humbler face. How much of the future might arise before her vision! Broadsides in the streets, signed with her father's name, exonerating the late Stephen Blackpool, weaver, from misplaced suspicion, and publishing the guilt of his own son, with such extenuation as his years and temptation, he could not bring himself to add his education, might beseech, were of the present. So Stephen Blackpool's tombstone, with her father's record of his death, was almost of the present, for she knew it was to be. These things she could plainly see. But how much of the future? A working woman christened Rachel, after a long illness, once again appearing at the ringing of the factory bell, and passing to and fro at the set hours among the Coctan hands. A woman of pensive beauty, always dressed in black, but sweet-tempered and serene, and even cheerful, who, of all the people in the place, alone appeared to have compassion on a degraded, drunken wretch of her own sex, who was sometimes seen in the town secretly begging of her, and crying to her. A woman working, ever working, but content to do it, and preferring to do it as her natural lot until she should be too old to labour any more. Did Louisa see this? Such a thing was to be. A lonely brother, many thousands of miles away, writing, on paper blotted with tears, that her words had too soon come true, and that all the treasures in the world would be cheaply bartered for a sight of her dear face. At length this brother coming nearer home, with hope of seeing her, and being delayed by illness. And then a letter, in a strange hand, saying, he died in hospital of fever such a day, and died in penitence and love of you, his last word being your name. Did Louisa see these things? Such things were to be.